Here is any good student of the Bible, any good reader of the Bible ought to know that not all translations are the same. You ought to know what kind of a translation you're buying and reading. And any good teacher of the Bible will tell you that you ought to use multiple translations. If you have a text that you're struggling with, my recommendation is you buy a translation or you access a translation that is one. Can things be lost in translation? And specifically in this case, can the meaning of biblical texts be so lost or lost enough where we don't understand what the original author was saying to the original audience? And are we way off when it comes to our modern views, specifically theological views or philosophically informed theological views? Some people like to say so. Quite a bit of people who are in the new age sort of camp to use these sorts of arguments and gather a following after themselves. And some people just use it as a denial method or something like that. I'm on the other camp. I think we can know quite a bit of these things. And if we study enough, then the meaning of these things could be and is a lot clearer and well rounded. One of my favorite YouTubers, and specifically one of my favorite atheist YouTubers, is Alex O'Connor from Cosmic Skeptic. And so Alex had a guest on, and his guest is a gentleman that runs this channel called At Magnify. This is his channel. He's made a very good YouTube channel that's got 1.5 million subscribers, and it seems like he only does shorts. Let's let Alex run with it.
You've got about 1.5 million subscribers, and you've managed to do it just through using YouTube Shorts. Some of the most interesting and captivating YouTube Shorts on the platform. I imagine that most people watching this, even if they don't know your name or know who you are, when they see your face and hear you talk, they'll recognize you because you're doing quite well for yourself. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's really exciting. Some of the stuff that you do that's really piqued my interest has been your biblical analyses in terms of the language and history of the Bible. We were just speaking a moment ago, and you told me that we could potentially do an entire episode just talking about the linguistic quirks of the very first phrase of the Bible. You open the Old Testament, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what I always read. What can you tell me about it?
There's a little bit more to the English version of Genesis 1:1, because as you said, it's in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then there's a period. There's a big fat punctuation mark, which is really quite interesting because as like an ancient language, ancient Hebrew doesn't have punctuation. So there's a big question about what is the significance of introducing a punctuation mark into a text in which one wasn't there. I think in ancient Hebrew, there is little markings on a scroll to let you know when you've reached the end of a line, but that's not the same thing as a period. And a period definitely has a meaning of this idea stops here and doesn't continue on to the next one. So there's a big question about whether or not there should be a period at the end of Genesis 1:1.
What difference would that make? Because what comes next? And the earth was without
shapeless and void, and the Spirit of God moved over the spirit of the waters.
Yeah.
Another period there. And God says, let there be light. So in the English version, by the time you get to let there be light, there may be 3 or 4 periods or 3 or 4 stops. Are you familiar with the Bible translator, Robert Alter?
No.
He's like probably the most highly regarded working translator. And he spent, very unusual for a Bible translator, that he spent about 20 years translating classical literature and then got sucked into this project of translating the Old Testament with all of that literary sensitivity to style and format that maybe someone who went to seminary isn't sensitive to. So when he talks about Genesis 1:1 and the punctuation, the literary effects of punctuation in Genesis 1:1, he talks about that it really slows down the pace and that for an original reader, there's a sense in Genesis 1 that the universe is happening extremely fast, like an explosion, which is really interesting. And so when he translates it, he says the original reader would feel that this is all happening very quickly. Like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was shapeless and void, and God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Right.
And Hebrew is also a much more like economical language, quicker language. The first verse, I think, in Hebrew, Genesis 1:1, is 7 words in Hebrew, and it takes English 12 words to accomplish the same thing. It's nearly double the speed, it takes double the length of time to say it, and it's got these plodding period marks that remove that information that this is an event that's happening rapidly. And you could say that is meaningless information, that it doesn't change anything about it. But to me, that seems like a interesting way to communicate something about the creation of the universe, that it happened fast rather than in this calculated, slow way, more of an explosion.
Yeah, the image that I have in my head of Genesis is the sort of old man in the sky doing this and doing that and fiddling with this and turning this on and turning that on.
Mhm.
I don't speak Hebrew at all. I can't read Hebrew. I'd say I had no idea that there was so much variance just in a single sentence like that. I know that a lot of these ancient languages don't have punctuation, but
Mhm.
I do wonder how ancient readers did separate out their ideas. Was it just sort of natural reading the text where one idea ended
Mhm.
and another started? Or, as you say,
Mhm.
there might have been indications of some kind of line
Mhm.
break or something, but was it really just this continuous stream of text?
I think that's very likely. And you have to think about the oral tradition of sharing this story.
Yeah.
So I have sitting in front of me the Tanakh, which is just the Old Testament, which is the Hebrew Bible. This is for Jewish people. This is for Jewish synagogues. And the way Genesis 1 reads is, and I'll get into this, but when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This is this exact thing I just read. But you notice it starts with when instead of in the beginning, when God began to create the heaven and the earth. Now, if we switch over to something like the ESV is going to have a period there, right? The Jewish translations of the Tanakh doesn't have a period there. The period comes right here at the end of verse 3 because it's one thought. The net will have a period there, right? The NET. The NASB will have a period there. So you get what's going on. And frankly, when I was in Bible college, we had a discussion about this when I took Old Testament. Partly because there's a good discussion, and I actually am very in favor of this discussion over the whether the first verses of the Bible is more of a statement or a title statement rather than a descriptive one. For example, if you want to read it this way, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, and that could be taken as a title to the creation account or kind of a descriptive account. And then you get into, then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So there's quite a bit of interpretation going on there. Now, here's the number of things that we need to qualify for people, how languages work. And this has nothing to do with the Bible. It's just the way how language works and how translations work. Every translation is an interpretation. You cannot translate a language without interpreting it. It would be impossible. It wouldn't make sense to the non-native people that are listening to you doing that. Put this in your back pocket. Every translation is an interpretation. Words mean different things in different cultures. But my concern is people coming to a conclusion. So therefore, because we have translators involved, therefore we can't know the actual meaning, which is, I think Alex hints at that. And I think that's just a dangerous way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Before it was even written down. So was the reader getting off to a calculated and calm and steady start? Or was this like in media res explosion onto the scene? And those were two different experiences first as a listener. And then when you're trying to translate that experience into a written scroll, it's a different reading experience to have this measured. I feel like that might be the same with poetry. There's a difference if you're like reading Byron or something like that, and you're just like blazing through it versus savoring each line and like getting hooked. So there's a big difference, I think. And Robert Alter, when he talks about the difference that these punctuation marks make, he says that the style of the passage is more than just like an embellishment of a message, but it's like a vital medium through which ideas are communicated. So it's like not something that you can just take it or leave it. This is how the Bible might be communicating something about this event.
Yeah, I want to ask how that problem can potentially be avoided. If there would be a way in translation, presumably not, given that everybody does include sort of normal English punctuation, but I wonder if there would be a way in translation to convey the same feeling of the sort of continual idea that still makes grammar.
So here's the thing is that all the scrolls we have, whether in Greek, all the ancient ones we have, whether in Greek or in Hebrew, have no punctuation marks. Punctuation marks are a result of translations, regardless. And sometimes you're looking at it and saying, I think here's where the thought ends. And sometimes you just don't know. The other thing with it is that you're probably looking at other translations that are earlier than. So it's not just like we look at the original Hebrew and people go, we'll just translate it to the English. They're looking at old texts like the Septuagint. They're looking at things like Syriac or Aramaic. They're looking at Armenian translations. And then they're seeing if the punctuations are agreed upon in those translations. And so therefore you have more of a case to make when it comes to translating it with those punctuations in your own language. Sometimes there aren't transitional words, or transitional words don't exist in those original languages. But in your language and the way your language works, you need a transitional word, and your transitional words can give different meanings. If you translate it as, you put a word like but in there, or yet, or if you change that up to and. And some of these languages might have that same word that's translated into those 2 or 3 English languages. Again, I'm not a linguist, I'm not a language expert here, but you ought to know these things when you're reading it. And so this is partly why we also have theological discussions and interpretive discussions as to, is that clause, is that sentence a contrast, or is it a comparison? What's going on here? And so you have lively discussions over these matters. And I wouldn't necessarily say they're of like utmost theological importance, meaning you change your whole view of God or something like that. But they are important to really important theological discussions. I don't know whether we can do what Alex is saying unless you just get rid of all punctuations, which is going to be really weird because English has punctuations in it.
You could maybe try to use commas instead or something. Or maybe write it as verse and have no full stops or punctuation, but like a line break. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Line break. And the earth was without form, but like maybe not a capital letter on the and, something like that.
Yes.
I don't
They
know.
do. That comes up in music notation a lot because you've got like someone delivering, here's the notes you have to manufacture to recreate this melody. But any musician knows that's not really the message. The message is like in the crescendos and you're more of a musician than I, so you probably know more of those.
If you try to take a poem and set it to music, it's actually incredibly difficult to do. I have a friend who worked with a very esteemed poet, and the idea was it was a musician friend and the esteemed poet, and they were going to come together and create a song. And I think it didn't work in the end because it turns out that good poets don't make good lyrics. And it's because if you read these lyrics, it's just like really weird. If you can't hear the tune and the phrasing, it's a bit clunky or it sounds a bit bad. And I'm thinking here, maybe like reading the Bible in translation is a bit like reading the lyrics to a song without knowing what the music is, without knowing what the phrasing is supposed to be. And it just makes it sound a bit more clunky and it almost have a different message.
I think with the Quran.
So that's the stuff that I'm careful about. Like he doesn't say it makes it have a different message, he says almost makes it have a different message, but regardless. No, not necessarily. That's not true. Now, you could say there are parts. And again, it's not that we're unaware of these parts. That's partly why we have theological discussions. This is why theologians disagree on these secondary issues, because they're saying, is it saying this? They're looking at the same text, they're looking at the same data, or is it saying this? Because is it a contrast, which means you interpret it this way, or is it that? We're very aware of these things. My kind of reaction, and I don't think Alex necessarily means this, but I want to be careful in this. My reaction is that somebody who doesn't know these things is watching this video, and 113,000 people have watched this video, and says, oh man, I knew it. Back to the whole telephone game thing. We can't really know what the Bible is saying. That's a really bad conclusion to come to, number one, that you can't know anything what the Bible says. But because they're not maybe experts in the matter or something like that, they also don't understand that there's theological discussions, because we are very aware of this. Do we take Genesis 1 or the first part of Genesis 1 as a title statement, or do we not? That's a real discussion. And some Christians do, some don't. Some have a lot of commentaries, will have their own translations. They won't use a translation of the text because they are experts in the languages. They will use their own translations of the text. Sometimes some of them will keep Hebrew words because they'll say, I don't really think there's a proper English word for this. So there's a number of commentaries I've read on the book of Ecclesiastes where they don't replace the word koheleth with teacher or the preacher. They don't think it's a good translation, either one of those words. And so they'll say it's called, and they'll just keep it in the text. And they'll tell you why they're doing that. Again, if we want to dig deep into these things and understand them well, that's the sort of stuff you have to be familiar with. But it's not that, it loses its meaning. You just have to be familiar as a good student of the text. You have to be familiar with the theological discourse around it.
They definitely take that approach.
And I think actually people just tend to forget this more when they're reading the Bible. They forget just how much a translation can completely alter our interpretation of the words. We're talking here.
Okay, we're going to look at this, whether it completely alters it or not. So these are, again, the little nuances and difficulties I come across with. They completely alter it. Like I said, every translation is an interpretation.
It seems maybe a little more trivial than some other examples. There are so many translation differences which are absolutely huge. I'm thinking of Paul in the New Testament writing about women. And there's this verse in 1 Timothy that he suffers not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Or rather, she should remain silent. And that sounds really bad. I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. But I've spoken to some scholars who think that the phrase for teach and assert authority are actually together. And Paul uses a word there which isn't the normal word for authority. He uses something else which tends to actually mean seizing authority that isn't rightfully yours. And so this little translation might have the verse read more as that a woman should not seize authority she doesn't have to speak in church. And these scholars say that he was writing to this church in Ephesus where there was this cult of Artemis, where it was like a feminine cult and they were taking over the churches. And I don't know how much credence I give to this, but it at least opened my eyes to the fact that the translation of a single word there can completely alter the way that you interpret a text.
There's definitely one of those in Genesis 1:1.
Okay, so before we get there, before we go to Genesis 1:1, one of the things that they don't deal with is what is a translation? Not all translations are equal. Not all translations into English are equal. Behind me, I have 2 copies of the Iliad. And those 2 copies are both in English, but they're very difficult. They're very different translations. One is a lot more difficult to read than the other because of the kind of translation it is. Both are English, both are translations. But there's something going on there, and you ask the question like, why would one be more difficult to read? Because of the following slide I'm going to show you. Here's why. Because Bible translations, and this isn't just Bible translations, this is translations generally speaking of anything that we translate into the English language, we're going to ask these questions. We're going to look at it and we're going to go, okay, what are we trying to accomplish with it? Is our goal, so translators will sit together and say, is our goal for this translation to be a word-for-word translation, which is called a formal equivalence? Is it a word-for-word translation? Are we looking at a meaning-for-meaning translation, closest natural translation? Are we looking for a thought-for-thought translation, which is a dynamic equivalence translation? Or are we looking for as a paraphrase? Are we trying to translate this or make a paraphrase out of it, which is a retelling of the story? Now, as a matter of fact, one of the things that you're going to see is this breakdown of all the text that you're reading. So when you're looking at the Bible specifically, you go, I would like to read something like the New American Standard Bible. And the New American Standard Bible is it's aiming for being a word-for-word translation. Now, as you go down the list, you're going more towards a paraphrase, a retelling. So here you'll see the Message, okay? Or you'll see this contemporary English version that's not used very much. The New International Reader's Version. And again, these all have purposes. Like the Message might be really good for your kids. As a matter of fact, it was written by the individual that wrote it for his daughter, I believe. Then you move into this thought for thought and you get the New Living Translation, the New International Version, the Christian Standard Bible. It used to be called the Holman Bible. Let's go back here. So you get literal translations like the NASB, ES. The ESV is more in between a thought for thought and word for word, but leans towards a word for word. The KJV, the New KJV, the Readable Bible. Again, that's because it's going into this area for a meaning for meaning, right? These are the sorts of questions people need to ask before they just go, oh, well, the translate. As if all translations are the same. My contention here is any good student of the Bible, any good reader of the Bible ought to know that not all translations are the same. You ought to know what kind of a translation you're buying and reading. And any good teacher of the Bible will tell you that you ought to use multiple translations. If you have a text that you're struggling with, my recommendation is you buy a translation or you access a translation that is one from here, one from here, one from here, and one from here. And that way, you will have a good sense. Hey, it's good to see you here on Apologia Center. This is a ministry that's there to provide you, the viewer, with content that's going to be informative for you, that you can learn from and apply into your life as you develop your worldview formation as a Christian. If you're not a Christian, you're more than welcome to be on this channel and maybe be challenged by some of the claims of Christianity and challenge us with your claims in a friendly, respectful way. I think this is a channel like no other on YouTube, frankly, because of the community we've developed. So if you want to be a part of this community, go ahead and hit the like button. Go ahead and subscribe to this channel. If you aren't subscribed, join us on Discord and jump onto our Patreon and just be a part of the community. If you're having a hard time with the meaning, you might want to look at a closest natural equivalency with a functional equivalency and a retelling, and then you get the meaning of the text. The problem with that might be that you don't know what the actual wording of the text is, or the closest thing to the actual wording of the text. But if you're doing studies and you want to know what the actual wording of a text is, what you're going to do is you're going to go and look at, say, one of these translations. Now, apart from this, one of the things you might want to do is you go look at the original languages, and we'll have an example of that as well.
Where it's not like, oh, this just changes the style, but radically separates the story into two very different things.
Tell me about it.
It's the second word of the Bible. So the first one, I think everyone agrees on. It just means at the start of something or in the beginning. It just takes one Hebrew word because, again, it's more economical. So everyone's agreed that about the first word, but then there's a lot of disagreement about what is actually beginning, because the second word of the Bible is a verb, create. And since there's no tense in ancient Hebrew, there's a lot of the tense of a verb is derived from context clues. So there's a lot of question over what is actually beginning at the beginning. And then there's a lot of question about whether created should be in the past tense, created, or an infinitive, to create. So in the beginning of God's act of creating versus in the beginning God created. Does that make difference between those two?
It could read something like, in the beginning of God's creation,
Yes.
this happened.
Yeah.
Or it could be, in the beginning, God made a creation. Something of that sort.
And I think the difference there is almost like if you look at a comic book strip, in one version, the first cell of the comic strip is just like a blank square because it's the beginning and there's nothing there yet. And then God creates the heavens and the earth, and it all appears in the second strip, the second cell of the comic strip. In the second version, if it's in the beginning of God's creating, then in that first cell of the comic strip, there might be some primordial materials that are already there. And then God starts to decide to make something out of it. So it's the beginning of his creating. It's not saying like in the beginning. It's just when God started to start making some stuff. And if you look at the actual like text, it seems to be more in support of that second option, because the second verse talks about the earth being shapeless and void, and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. So if that verb is truly past tense and God created everything, how was there all this material before he created anything? So it doesn't seem like...
So a little comment on that is that, again, this goes back to the idea of the disagreement as to whether that first sentence ought to be taken as a title statement. Because if you take that first statement as a title statement, then you're like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the title. And then it goes on to give you the text. The earth was formless and void, and so on and so forth. That's why you'll have a period after that, because a lot of interpreters go, this is more of a, it's emphasizing the entire text as a total unit, what we're going to look at. You can sandwich that with the way the text ends. Okay. And the way the text ends is actually not in chapter 1. The entire text ends in chapter 2, verse 4, because it says, this is the account of the creation of the heavens and the earth. Now, if you look at that as a parallel, you're going to look at it with verse 1, and it's going to say, in the beginning, God created the what? Heavens and the earth. And those are the sandwich units. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Tells you all that stuff. These are the accounts of how the heavens and the earth are created. This last statement, which is in chapter 2, verse 4. And you get like the actual creation stuff happening in between that. There are reasons, is what I'm trying to say. And there are very intelligent reasons as to why people are looking at it. Now, I am a lot more sympathetic towards the translation of when God began to create the heavens and the earth, partly because I do think the text teaches that there's this primordial material that God is working with. And some people have said, yeah, look, you can't very clearly get like a creation ex nihilo from Genesis 1. And I'm okay with that, because I think the text is trying to do something anyways. I think if you take in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth as a title statement, then you can argue for a creation ex nihilo. And then there's this primordial stuff that God is working with. There's other places in the Bible where you can get creation ex nihilo from. Again, important for people to be well knowledgeable on these things whenever they're coming across a conversation or watching a video. Oh man, now we don't know what it means. Oh, I'm so struggling. No, because you don't know what it means because you're not a student of the Bible. And I would say a vast majority of people are biblically illiterate in our culture, but they'll watch these things or they'll share little reels or something like that. And I say this for Christians and non-Christians alike. Be good students of the Bible if you're actually interested in the conversation, whether you believe it's true or not. Just don't be a lousy student and then tell people, I watched a video, and in the video it says that you can't know what it says. And that's not what they're necessarily saying, but I know that plenty of people will take it like that.
Saying in the formal beginning of everything, it's just...
Yeah. I mean, typically the image we have is God creates the heaven and the earth. So he pops into existence this thing called the earth, and then there is this earth, which is without form and void, or formless, or whatever word you like to use. And I've never quite known exactly what that means for the earth to be without form and void.
That's an encroachment of like Greek philosophy onto the text from what I've read, because the word that's actually used in the Hebrew is like a made-up word.
We'll look
like
at that.
Helter-skelter. And then when, I guess, the Greek translators were trying to figure out how do we communicate this made-up word into our new culture, they borrowed that classic Greek idea of form and formlessness. And so that's like more of a Greek encroachment of a more philosophical statement, where
that's fascinating.
the Hebrew uses like a more playful word for just like the earth was helter-skelter, basically.
I think he's going to, that whole aspect of, this is Greek philosophy encroaching on the biblical text and stuff like that. I think biblically you can argue that it's not. And I'll prove from within the Bible it's not. And then I'll also prove from what he says, because he quotes a specific translator. That translator doesn't even think that's the way it should be translated.
That word is trying to get at?
It's just like a made-up, it's like a made-up word. Like it's like a sing-songy word.
Really? And we don't see that word used anywhere else?
I think it's used one other time in Bible, but as an intentional reference to where it appears here.
Really? So I suppose we don't really know what it's supposed to be saying. So we've got...
Okay, so let's look at whether we know what the word means or not. This is going to get really good. I got multiple translations here that I'm going to run you guys through. Check it out. So the wording we're looking at here is without form and void. Now, what's the Hebrew here? What are we looking at when it comes to these words without form and void? Actually, we'll come here. We'll use the net because it focuses on that. So the Net Bible translates this as without shape and empty. So the word is tohu bohu. And it is like that. It's supposed to be singy, songy, rhymey, so you get it. So the way this would read is, now the earth was tohu and bohu, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. My problem is that we don't know what this word means. If we don't know what the word means, why is it that we have multiple translations that say something like it's without shape and empty, or it is without form and void? The Tanakh translates this as unformed and void. The NA translates this as formless and void. The New Living Translations says it's formless and empty. This is probably my favorite translation, and this one says without form and chaotic. And I think there's an interpretive thing going into this whole, what does it mean for it to be chaotic? Because I think they understand that there's chaos in the beginning, and what God is doing is reforming the chaos. And so it's tohu bohu. Yeah, it is meant to be that, if you want to say singy song, rhymey, so you remember it. So it was, notice that when we're looking at this text here, we're looking at, this is the interlinear from, this is the interlinear. Put it that way. The Lexem interlinear. Notice this in the beginning, the create, or created, heavens and so on and so forth. And it gets, and the earth be, or was, or it was a wasteland, unformed. Could be translated wasteland, and empty. If you go to the net, is going to give you a couple of passages here you can go to. One of them is in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 11, where it reads, "But the hawk and the porcupine shall possess it. The owl and the raven shall dwell in it. He shall stretch the line of confusion over it, and the plumb line of emptiness." Now, if you go to Isaiah 11, you'll see this word right here is bohu. Now, what is he talking about here? If you go to the beginning, it has to do with judgment. And so as God is judging, destroying, bringing to destruction, he says, "The streams of Edom shall be turned into a pitch, and her soil into sulfur." You get the destruction here. "Her land shall become burning pitch. Night and day it shall be quenched. Its smoke shall rise up forever." Clearly that's not meant to be literal, but it's apocalyptic judgment language. "From generation to generation it shall lie in waste. None shall pass through it before and ever. But the hawk and the porcupine shall possess it. Animals. The owl and the raven shall dwell in it. He shall stretch the line of confusion over it, and the plumb line of emptiness. Its nobles, there is no one there to call it a kingdom, and all its princes shall be nothing." So it's empty of human inhabitants. That's why right there, bohu is translated as emptiness, because it clearly tells you. Now, it's not completely empty, but it's empty of inhabitants and human beings and so on and so forth. So that's the Isaiah passage that gets used. The other one is the one that they were thinking about, is that of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah 23 says, "I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void. So it was tohu and bohu, almost, and the heavens, and they had no light. I looked on the mountains, and behold, there was quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. And so again, you get this judgment language. You get this chaos language. Because again, if you know your theology and you know your Bible well, what God is putting into order in Genesis is the chaos that God brings under his control and gives. This empty and void can be translated, I think, this tohu bohu, as just chaos. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and there was chaos.
The earth is something.
Chaos,
And
chaotic.
immediately the meaning of this text is falling apart to me and makes me want to go and study Hebrew, to be honest, because
So here's again where Alex is saying, well, immediately this text is falling apart to me. And I would say, Alex, put on the brakes, buddy. Go consult some scholars. And again, I'm sorry, with all due respect to Magnify, who's on this, he only quotes one person that actually doesn't translate this text anything other than what I just read. And he does some really cool rhymey stuff with it, I think, that I like. But you go look at any translation, you go look at some scholars, and you go, yeah, this is empty and void means for it to be chaotic, without order. And then what do you get for the rest of Genesis, as a matter of fact? Order. God puts everything in order. And that makes sense. But it's not, we don't know what it means now. What are we going to do? Consult experts.
I just can't get a grasp of what any of it means. Depending on when it's translated into a different language, when it's translated into English, what the translator is trying to get across, you can just totally change the meaning of what the text is supposed to be saying based on essentially what philosophy is popular at the time.
Yeah, you can, but people don't, is my thing. And this is why we have this. This is why we don't just translate things from translations. We don't look at the English and then we go, oh, let's just use the Septuagint and as our translation source. That's why we go back to the Hebrew, and then you compare the Hebrew with the Septuagint, and you compare the Septuagint with a later translation, like the Syriac or the Armenian or the Georgian. You do all this work, and that work matters. And I feel like this oversimplifying what translators do. I have the utmost respect for translators, generally speaking, and for Bible translators, specifically speaking. I thank God for them, and I just thank them so much for doing all the work that they do. There's a council of people that get together on any translation of the Bible, and they're all experts in their own areas. They don't just go, it's one guy as though I'm going to let my philosophical kind of grounding just guide me in this translation, and you just completely miss the point of the text. That's why you have peers that are experts in this, that can challenge you within those committees to make these translations. And so again, that stuff matters a lot, and the oversimplification of it, I think, is just unhelpful.
Yes.
And that is scary, actually. How do you think we should read this text?
So check this out.
Carefully is probably the correct answer there, but how do you approach it?
The way that Robert Alter translates it, who I really admire, is he translates that phrase as the world was welter and waste. So it's a little playful and a little bit more childlike, and it's like sing-songy, because you can't manufacture a new word in the language, but he says it's welter and waste. So it's like a little poetic, kind of
welter
rhymey
and waste.
Because formless and void sounds so like stately, and the original is, I think, a little bit more playful and more childlike. So to be true to that literary effect.
It's welter and waste, which is, it's a wasteland. Did I not read from the Isaiah passage and the Jeremiah passage? That'll be like empty and void, a waste, that it's without form and void. Like when we empty and formless, these aren't bad translations, or they're missing stuff. Maybe waste is the best translation. You can make an argument for that. Or maybe waste has translators would sit there and say, waste has too many meanings in English that people can understand, right? And I'll tell you exactly why, as to why some people might not use the word wasteland. Part of it because wasteland presumes something existing, and then there's a destruction of it, and that's laid waste. And so people might come up with theological opinions, and some have. As a matter of fact, I'll prove it to you from this commentary here. And some have ignorantly, I think, in regards to the whole text of the biblical teaching, some folks have thought that this aspect of empty and void presumes an earlier creation that God destroyed and is recreating. And for example, in the NET commentary on the words here says, the latter use of the term, the latter use in regards to Isaiah, The latter use of the term has led some to conclude that Genesis 1:2 presupposes the judgment of a prior world, but it is unsound method to read the latter application of the imagery in a context of judgment back into Genesis 1:2. So maybe some people aren't translating it as a waste, and Robert Alter doesn't care about this because he's not necessarily looking at theological implications of the text, which would be very strange considering that you're translating a theological text that's communicating a theological idea about God. And so some people would say maybe waste or wasteland would not be the best of translations. It would lead to more confusion. So we're going to go with something like empty and without shape. Again, I just want to affirm the idea that these things aren't randomly done, that translators put lots of pain into the work that they're doing. So appreciate the translators of your Bible. Understand that every translation is an interpretation. Use multiple translations. And if you have access to other languages, use other languages. I know people that read their Bibles in English, they read it in Russian, they read it in Armenian because they say they get a better understanding of it. Whenever I have questions about my English translations, I like accessing an Armenian translation to see if there's something different in there or different words that are used, maybe that are a bit richer than the English word, and that helps me in that. And or you can just go learn Greek and Hebrew and then do it that way, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, and then be able to dig into the depths of that. But at the end of the day, have good respect and admiration for the people who translate anything, but specifically Bible translations. Now, if you're also interested, I did an interview with a translator and we talked about the ethics of translation. So go ahead and click on this video that's going to pop up here and go check out that interview with that translator who speaks about the ethics of translating anything.